morning. Nice to see everyone. So last week, Neil presented several captions, clips about sports oriented and how that can relate to Christian life. And so I'm going to continue that theme today, and I'm going to look at the passages that refer to sports and other types of things like that today. Paul is the main author who makes use of those type of analogies. And his main things, I think, points. That's an odd sound. The men at work doesn't sound like them, but just kidding. But the points where it shows endurance, discipline, and focus that needed for sports and athletics are similar to what Christians need. And I can relate to that to some degree. I'm no great athlete or anything, but I was on my high school soccer team. And so at the time, now, probably most people who know, I've been a runner pretty much my whole life. Actually, I was inspired in 1976 by the Olympics and have kept it pretty consistent still since then. Now, I've never been what you would call really good. I would classify myself as almost good enough for the cross-country team. But I was in really good enough shape for the soccer team, so I thought I had it made. Now, at that time, the reward for being on a high school team was you got a high school letter. And that was a cool thing. It's like, hey, now most sports had to do with a Sabbath. But my my concentration is going to be text today. But anyway, and I don't know if people can hear it on the audio, but there's construction going on next door. But anyway, I forgot what I was saying, something about playing soccer. Yeah, you got a high school letter, so that was your reward. Now, and we were told at the time, and I really doubt this helps you that much, oh, it looks good on your college application to have a letter, varsity letter. Okay, great. Well, this particular sport had two advantages. One, no Sabbath games, or hardly any, and then no cuts. If you came out for practice, you made the team. Well, a whole bunch of my friends, I didn't know these people really yet. It was my first year there. The whole bunch of people came out to play soccer. Now, I didn't even know what the shape of a soccer ball was, so I had that disadvantage. So I wasn't very good, but I could run. And a whole bunch of people that came out could not. And so by the second day, there was probably 40 people came for the first day and probably 20 the second. So what the coach did to unofficial cuts is I've never ran that many wind sprints and stretches in my life. And I was a little cocky. I thought I could handle it. But, man, I have never been so sore as I was the next day. So just getting that letter, it did take some perseverance and patience sitting the bench, not getting to play except during scrimmages. But anyway, so I can appreciate some of the lessons Paul was talking about. Now, in looking at the history of sports in the Roman Empire at that time, I found that chariot racing was actually the most popular sport, very popular. And boxing and wrestling was also popular. Now, I guess I should add gladiator sports to that, although to me that's not exactly a true sport. I guess it depends. But I think most of the participants were not voluntary. But I don't really know much about gladiator stuff. But anyway, now Paul does reference boxing, but he does not make a single reference, at least in the Bible, to chariot racing. And I'm not sure why not. I was thinking maybe it was because it was not prevalent. I mean, the Roman Empire was a humongous section of the world, Maybe it just wasn't in the area Paul was familiar with. Maybe he didn't find it an appropriate analogy or good for Christian living. Or maybe he did use those as analogy. It just didn't make it into any of our writings. Because you got to think about it. Out of the probably 100,000 speeches Paul made, when he went around, we've got a very small sampling of what he said. Anyway, so he does reference running a good bit, which, and I'm not sure what type of contest he was referring to, because when I looked it up, running was not really a popular sport, at least according to the sources I saw. But it must have been at least known to Paul and his readers, because he references it kind of a lot. So the first verse I have is 1 Timothy 4. And this is starting in verse 6. And this is obviously Paul's instruction to Timothy, who is a younger minister. And so Paul tells him, starting in verse 6, if you instruct the brethren in these things, you will be a good minister of Jesus Christ, nourished in the words of faith and the good doctrine which you have carefully followed. But reject profane and old wives' fables, and exercise yourself toward godliness. And here's what he says: for bodily exercise profits a little, but godliness is profitable for all things, having the promise of life that is now is, and of that which is to come. So two of the principles, discipline and focus, I feel like are in this one. The exercise yourself toward godliness is saying that we have to work at being godly. It's not just a no-effort proposition. And the focus is keeping that eye on the ultimate prize, which he says in this verse, the promise of life. So the next verse I have is Hebrews 12, and starting in verse 1. Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. Of course, this is after the faith chapter where he lists a whole bunch of people that were faithful in the Old Testament. And that cloud of witnesses, I wonder if that's an allusion to a stadium of spectators. Maybe, maybe not. But let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Looking to Jesus as our author and finisher. In other words, Jesus is the goal. And that he endured the cross, and so consider him who endured that hostility, and so you don't become discouraged. So he's saying, if you're keeping your, and if you're following along, you're saying, what version is he reading? But I'm paraphrasing a little bit. He's saying that if you keep your eyes on the prize, it'll help you from being discouraged. And believe me, things in this life are going to try to discourage you. So 2 Timothy 2, again, Paul's talking to Timothy. He goes, you therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Jesus Christ. You must therefore endure hardship as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. No one is engaged in warfare entangles himself with the affairs of this life, that he may please him who enlisted him as a soldier. And if anyone competes in athletics, he is not crowned unless he competes according to the rules. And the hardworking farmer must be first to partake of the crops. So we saw Paul also uses soldiers and farmers in addition to athletics as a somewhat common analogy he likes to use. And here, the good soldier focuses. He's got, he doesn't worry about a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't have to do with his soldiering. And I think the point is Christians should do the same. And then verse 10 says, Therefore I endure all things for the sake of the elect, that they may also obtain the salvation which is in Jesus Christ. Again, of course, I guess I'm a broken record here. The goal is the ultimate salvation. So a little bit further down, Timothy 4 in verse 4, chapter 4, verse 1, and Paul tells him, I charge you therefore before God and the Lord Jesus Christ. Verse 5, be watchful in all things, endure afflictions, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith, and finally there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous God, will give me on that day. So we have a couple there where he's speaking of fighting, the boxing, and running, the race. So in 1 Corinthians 9, we have where Paul is defending himself and Barnabas. Apparently he's receiving some criticism for how he's conducting his ministry. And he points out that God does allow, matter of fact, he expects his servants to be fed from the proceeds of the flock. And but then Paul says, even though I have that right, in verse 12 he goes, nevertheless, we have not used this right, but we endure all things lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. For if I do this willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will I have been entrusted with a stewardship, what is my reward then? That when I preach the gospel, I may present the gospel of Christ without charge, that I may not abuse my authority in the gospel. Do you not know that all who run in a race, but one receives the prize? So you run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for a prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we do it for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty, and thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest, when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. So this one has lots of sports allusions to it. And here Paul praises athletes for being temperate in all things. That is, when they're extremely serious, and this is today as well, they don't smoke, drink, party, stay up late. They behave themselves essentially and take care of themselves. Well, Paul says that's a good thing, and that Christians, we should be doing the same thing, and they're doing it just to receive some temporary reward here, accolades from the government or the other people, and you get a trophy. But back then, I think they got a wreath. But but he's saying, but we've got a much, much better reward that we're struggling for. All right, so in Galatians 2 and 5, Paul compares running to the Christian walk, and that's Galatians 2, verse 2, and Galatians 5, verse 7. I'll just mention those. It just says, lest by any means I might run or had run in vain. And then in Galatians 5:5, he says, talking to these people that they've run well. In other words, they've performed their Christian life well so far. So what's hindering them from obeying the truth? So that's just a mild reference, I guess. And then Philippians 3, starting in verse 12. And then Paul saying, not that I have already attained or already perfected, but I press on that I may lay hold of that for which Christ has laid hold of me. Brethren, I do not count myself to have apprehended, but I do one thing, forgetting those things are behind and reaching forward to those things are ahead. I press toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of Jesus. And I think one thing we can get from that verse is if by this stage of a career, if Paul thought he had to keep pressing, obviously that applies to every one of us, if not double. So Ephesians 6, this is a famous verse about the armor of God. In verse 11, I'll just cut to the middle of it. It says, put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand the wiles of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age. Again, an allusion to wrestling. Now, the Old Testament does not have pretty much any allusions to sports itself. It does have a few, like in Isaiah 40, verse 31. It says God will renew their strength, and they will run and not be weary. But I think most of the athletic type references in the Old Testament are more related to military type things. And I think the main reason for that is in the Hebrew culture, sports just wasn't a thing, whereas it was in the Greco-Roman world. So now these references were basically all from Paul, except there was a reference in Hebrews. Now, there's a debate about who wrote Hebrews, but the fact it uses a running reference, actually I think is kind of good evidence that he did write Hebrews. Now, it's obviously not a slam dunk, but that no one else really used that reference that we have. Who knows? They could have. So I think it appears Paul may have been a bit of a sports fan. I don't know. But I think more than that, he liked analogies and metaphors. He just liked coming up with... He probably got tired of saying the same thing over and over, so he had to keep coming up with different ways to get his point across. So now these are, if you want to look up endurance, discipline, and focusing, these are actually some of the best main verses on it. But of course, there's plenty of others, and I've got one of them is Colossians 3 for teaching the right focus. And this says, if then you were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is sitting at the right hand of God. Set your mind on the things above, not on the things of the earth. That's a little harder to do than to read, but, it's very important. 2 Corinthians 10 for teaching discipline. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. Self-discipline, self-control. And Galatians 5, which is the fruit of the Spirit section, it for teaching endurance, self-control, and discipline. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, and peace, but long-suffering, self-control, against there is no such law. And those who were Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live in the Spirit, let us walk in the Spirit. And finally, I'll leave you this one verse from Jesus himself. And this is Matthew 24:13. But he who endures to the end shall be saved.